At its peak, Necco produced 4 billion wafers a year, 8 billion conversation hearts. The company employed 1,300 workers in a Cambridge factory so massive it served as the city's designated bomb shelter during World War II. The US government bought their entire production run for soldiers' ration kits. Admiral Byrd packed 2.5 tons of their candy for his Antarctic expedition. MIT students breathed in the smell of chocolate and peppermint every morning on their way to class, so constant that by October, their brains stopped registering it. For 171 years, Necco made candy that mattered, candy that went to war, candy that went to the South Pole, candy that grandmothers slipped to children in church pews. And then, in a single summer, it all disappeared. The workers sent home. The machines gone silent. The question nobody answered in time. What kills something that survived everything else? If you walked past 250 Massachusetts Avenue in Cambridge anytime between 1927 and 2003, you'd know it before you saw it. The smell, chocolate and peppermint, root beer and wintergreen, sugar melting and reforming, drifting out through the vents of a building that ran 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week for 76 years. MIT students on their way to class breathed it in every morning. Cab drivers who didn't know street names knew where Necco was. Just follow your nose. One alumnus remembered that the smell greeted him at the start of every semester, so constant that by October, his brain stopped registering it. Fortunately, he said, recovery came fast after each vacation. The factory's glass-bricked windows made the interior invisible from the street. You couldn't see the workers. You couldn't see the conveyor belts or the vats of molten sugar. You just knew somehow that something sweet was being made in there. Something that had been made there since before your parents were born. Since before their parents were born. A candy historian who lived in Cambridge in the 1970s put it simply, that smell was there. It just permeated. Today, the building still stands. It's a research facility now. Novartis, the pharmaceutical company, paid $175 million to convert it into laboratories. Workers had to power wash the concrete walls to remove sugar spores that had burrowed into the pores over decades. They scraped gooey residue off basement floors that had been soaked in syrup since the Coolidge administration. The iconic water tower on the roof, once painted to look like a 40-foot-tall roll of Necco wafers visible across the city, now displays a DNA double helix. The smell is gone. But here's what's strange. When a reporter toured the company's final factory in Revere, months after it had closed for good, months after the workers had been sent home and the machines had stopped, he noticed something. Remarkably, he wrote, the smell of candy still lingered, as if the building itself was holding on. This is the story of the New England Confectionery Company, America's oldest candy maker, a company that survived 2 world wars, a Great Depression, and a century and a half of changing tastes. A company that fed candy to polar explorers and sent 8 billion conversation hearts into the world every year. A company that perfumed a neighborhood for 3 generations and then collapsed in the end amid rodent droppings and rotting infrastructure and financial maneuvering that valued the building more than the candy or the people who made it. How does something that lasted 171 years fall apart so completely? How does a factory that once employed 1,300 people end up with FDA inspectors counting droppings too numerous to count on trays of sweethearts? That's the question. And to answer it, we have to go back to the beginning, back to 1847, back to a young pharmacist in Boston, rolling sugar paste by hand, one lozenge at a time, dreaming of a better way. In 1847, a 26-year-old pharmacist named Oliver Chase was working in a small apothecary in Boston with his brothers, Silas Edwin and Daniel. The work was tedious. Every day, Chase rolled ropes of sugar and gum dough mixed with medicinal ingredients like peppermint for stomach problems, ginger for nausea, and yes, opium for just about everything else, then cut them, one by one, into small round lozenges. Each one had to be roughly the same size. Each one had to dry properly. Each one had to be packaged by hand. The results were inconsistent. The process was slow, and Oliver Chase, by all accounts, was not a patient man. So he built something. We don't know exactly what it looked like. No drawings survive, but historians describe it as resembling a hand-cranked pasta maker. You fed sheets of sugar dough through one end, turned a crank, and dozens of identically sized circular discs came tumbling out the other side. Uniform, consistent, fast. It was, by most accounts, the first American candy machine. The Candy Hall of Fame would later credit Chase's invention as the founding of the US candy industry, as well as the beginning of commercial candy production. That might sound like overstatement. It isn't. Before Chase, candy in America was handmade, expensive, and wildly inconsistent. After Chase, it could be manufactured at scale. Now, the story usually told about Oliver Chase makes him an English immigrant who arrived in Boston with nothing but ambition, and a good idea. It's a nice story. The immigrant makes good narrative that Americans love. The truth is more complicated. Census records from 1870, 1880, and 1900 all list his birthplace as Massachusetts. His wife was born in England. At least one of his children was born there too. He held a British patent, so maybe he went back and forth. Maybe the records are wrong. What we know for certain is that he was in Boston by 1847, and he had invented something that would change an industry. Character details about Chase are scarce, but we have one surviving letter, written in 1883 on company letterhead. In it, he describes a business proposition with barely contained enthusiasm. From the present assurances, it looks very promising, more so than my legitimate business, with less care and detail. I am ready to go ahead without delay, a restless entrepreneur, always looking for the next opportunity, always ready to move. He retired in 1888 and died on December 2nd, 1902, in Thornton, New Hampshire. He was inducted into the Candy Hall of Fame in 2006, more than a century after his death. Recognized at last for the machine that started everything. But the machine was only the beginning. In 1866, Oliver's brother Daniel had an idea of his own. The lozenges were already stamped into uniform shapes. What if you could stamp words onto them too? Daniel devised a system using a felt roller pad moistened with red vegetable dye, pressed against a metal printing die. You could print a message directly onto the candy. No paper insert, no wrapper to read. The candy itself could speak. The inspiration probably came from cockles, popular candies of the era shaped like seashells, with paper fortunes tucked inside. Daniel's innovation cut out the middleman. The message became part of the product. Because the original lozenges were large, they could accommodate surprisingly long phrases, Victorian sentiments printed in red dye. How long shall I have to wait? Please be considerate. Or riddle-style exchanges. Why is a stylish girl like you a thrifty housekeeper? Because she makes a big bustle about a little waste. Some were used at weddings, dispensing relationship advice. Married in white, you have chosen right. And the darkly prophetic, married in pink, he'll take to drink. The candies weren't heart-shaped yet. That would come later in 1902, when the company began producing the iconic hearts branded as sweethearts. But Daniel Chase had created something that would outlast him by more than a century, candy that talks. By the late 1800s, Boston had become one of America's great candy cities. Cambridge's Main Street had so many confectioners that locals called it Confectioners Row. A 1947 newspaper article noted that New England was one of 4 major candy-producing centers in the nation, with over 90% of output concentrated in Massachusetts. In 1950, Boston and Cambridge were home to 140 candy companies. Candy was to Boston what computers would later be to Silicon Valley. And in 1901, 3 of those companies, Chase & Company, Forbes Hayward & Company, and Wright and Moody, merged to form a new entity. They called it the New England Confectionery Company, Necco. The newly combined company moved fast. In 1902, they constructed a complex of 4 5-story buildings at 253 Summer Street in Boston's Fort Point neighborhood. It was at the time the largest establishment in the United States devoted entirely to candy production. The Boston Wharf Company, apparently proud of their new tenant, named the adjacent streets Necco Court, Necco Street, and Necco Place. Those names survive today. But what really distinguished Necco in those early decades wasn't size, it was durability. Not of the company, though, that too, but of the product itself. Necco wafers don't melt. They have a shelf life exceeding 2 years. They're, in the company's own description, practically indestructible during transit. These weren't designed as features. They were accidents of chemistry, sugar, corn syrup, and gelatin, pressed into thin discs and dried until they could survive almost anything. It turned out that this made them ideal for war. In 1917, when America entered World War I, the US government purchased the entire annual production run of Necco wafers for soldiers' ration packs. Every wafer the factory could make went into a military-issue tin and shipped across the Atlantic. And when those soldiers came home, they remembered the taste. They'd eaten Necco wafers in trenches, in training camps, on transport ships. The candy meant something to them. It meant survival. It meant home. The same thing happened again in World War II. The government requisitioned a major portion of the production. Soldiers carried Necco wafers through North Africa, through Italy, through the Pacific. And when they came home, they kept buying them. The post-war period became Necco's strongest sales era, but perhaps the most remarkable endorsement came from explorers. In 1913, Arctic explorer Donald Macmillan packed Necco wafers for his Crocker Land expedition. The candy provided quick energy in brutal conditions and helped foster goodwill with local Inuit children. Then in 1930, Admiral Richard Byrd prepared for his Antarctic expedition, 2 years in the most hostile environment on Earth. He ordered 2.5 tons of Necco wafers. That's about £1 per man per week for the entire journey. Necco never used Byrd in their advertising. They could have. The candy that went to the South Pole would have made a hell of a slogan. But that wasn't Necco's style. They were old-fashioned, modest, not particularly savvy about branding. What they were savvy about was making candy, and by the mid-1920s they needed a bigger factory. In 1927, Necco moved into a new building at 250 Massachusetts Avenue, Cambridge, directly across from MIT. The building was designed in the modern style by company engineer F.C. Lutzer and constructed by Lockwood and Green. It stretched 500,000 square feet across 6 floors of reinforced concrete, faced in beige brick and trimmed with limestone. At its opening, it was proclaimed the largest factory in the world devoted entirely to candy making. Alfred Barr, founder of the Museum of Modern Art, wrote about it in the Arts magazine the following year. He called it robed in rich yellow brick, crowned by a smokestack he compared to an Italian basilica. One of the most living and beautiful buildings in New England, he wrote, a candy factory, praised by the founder of MoMA. The physical details hint at the scale of ambition. Floors 9 to 14 inches thick, capable of supporting 250 pounds per square foot, 14-foot ceilings. 18-inch concrete in some sections, thick enough that during World War II, the building served as Cambridge's designated bomb shelter. In the basement, 6 tanks stored 30,000 gallons of corn syrup, molasses, and sugar. Railroad cars delivered raw materials through a ground-floor loading dock. A sugar train came by about once a month, late at night, when the streets were empty. The glass-bricked windows weren't decorative. They were functional, installed to protect the candy from direct sunlight, which could cause discoloration. But they had an unintended effect. They made the interior invisible from outside. One MIT student remembered it years later with a kind of wonder. "I never saw anyone inside. The windows never opened, and I swear I never once saw anyone come in or out of the front gate on Massachusetts Avenue, a building that produced millions of pieces of candy a day, and from the street it looked sealed, mysterious." What one observer called Willy Wonka mystique, decades before Roald Dahl wrote the book. Inside, assembly lines ran vertically through all 6 floors, powered by gravity. Raw materials entered at the top. Finished candy emerged at the bottom. Workers toiled alongside vats and conveyor belts, dipping, molding, and shaping taffy and toffee rolls, sky bars, candy hearts, and of course Necco wafers. When the factory opened, it employed 1,300 people. The door handles were inscribed with the Necco insignia. Executive offices were paneled in oak. Wicker wheelchairs sat on each floor in case someone got hurt. A locker in the cafeteria held helmets and stretchers for air raids. And then there was the water tower. In 1996, for the company's 150th anniversary, workers painted the water tower on the roof to look like a 40-foot tall roll of Necco wafers. It became one of Cambridge's most recognizable landmarks, visible across the city. Fraternity party flyers gave directions as across from the Necco factory. Cab drivers who didn't know street names usually knew where Necco was. But more than anything else, more than the architecture, more than the landmark water tower, more than the 6 floors of candy production, what people remember is the smell. Imagine walking to work on a cold morning in 1955. You're approaching the factory from the west, and the wind carries it towards you before you even turn the corner. Chocolate, not the sharp, processed chocolate smell of modern candy bars. Something richer, more complex, mixed with peppermint, bright and clean, and underneath it, the warm caramel sweetness of sugar being cooked at scale. If they were making root beer barrels that day, you'd know it. If they were running the wintergreen line, you'd know that too. The smell changed with the production schedule. Some days were better than others. One MIT alumnus remembered the best days, when they were making peppermint chocolate somethings. Another recalled that if the wind came from the west, we enjoyed the smell of chocolate from Necco, but if there was an easterly breeze, the smell of the Lever Brothers soap company was a decidedly less pleasant experience. Workers who spent 30 years on that floor carried the smell home in their clothes. Their families knew it. One worker's wife could tell what line he'd been running that day just by hugging him when he walked through the door. This was the golden age, the decades when everything worked. The factory produced 4 billion Necco wafers per year at its peak. 8 flavors: lemon, lime, orange, clove, cinnamon, wintergreen, licorice, and chocolate, each a distinct pastel color. The manufacturing process was essentially unchanged since 1847. Sugar, corn syrup, and gelatin mixed into paste, rolled into sheets, cut into uniform discs by rotary cutters, descended directly from Oliver Chase's original machine, dried in tunnel dryers, stacked into rolls of 24, and wrapped in wax paper. As late as 1995, Necco was still using 4 giant wafer cutting machines that had been made around 1900. Nobody really knew for sure exactly when they'd been built, one employee admitted. They just kept running. A man named Joe Wicks worked at Necco for 55 years. They called him Mr. Candy Cupboard. In 1995, he captured something essential about the company. "We make 4.5 billion Necco wafers a year, and we make them on the equipment we brought with us when we moved left here in 1927. The same machines, 68 years later. But Necco made more than wafers. Sky Bar debuted in 1938, the first molded candy bar in America, with 4 different centers in one chocolate shell: caramel, vanilla, peanut, and fudge, each in its own section. The launch featured a dramatic skywriting advertising campaign. And on VE Day in 1945, when Times Square's lights came back on after years of wartime blackout, a Necco Sky Bar sign was one of only 6 illuminated. Mary Jane's had been around since 1914. Peanut butter and molasses taffy, created by Charles N. Miller in a building that was reportedly the former home of Paul Revere. The same little girl in a yellow dress and bonnet has appeared on the wrapper for more than a century. Candy buttons, tiny dots of flavored sugar on strips of paper. 3 flavors, cherry pink, lime blue, lemon yellow, eventually reached production of 750 million per year. And then there were the failures. Every candy company has them. Horehound ovals, jujube monoplanes, Wang Bees, chocolate Needhams, Montevideos, and the unforgettably named Climax mint patties. The workers who made all of this came from the neighborhoods surrounding the factory. In the early decades, they were largely Italian. By the end, they were predominantly Brazilian. Cambridge's immigrant workforce, generation after generation, showing up for the morning shift. A young man could start at 18. If he was good, if he was reliable, he could work his way up, run a line, train the new guys, retire at 65 with a pension and a paid-off house. Some families had 3 generations on that floor simultaneously. Grandfather, father, son. The factory shaped the rhythm of the neighborhood. Shift changes meant traffic. Lunch breaks meant crowds at the diner across the street. When the day shift let out at 4, you could watch the stream of workers heading home, the smell of sugar still clinging to their clothes. And then there were the sweethearts. By the time Necco closed, the company was producing 8 billion sweethearts conversation hearts every year, £100,000 per day. Roughly 40% of the entire Valentine candy market, up to 80% of non-chocolate Valentine's candy. Production ran nearly year-round, from late February through mid-January. 11 months of manufacturing consumed in 6 weeks. The process hadn't changed much since Daniel Chase's time. Sugar crushed into fine powder, combined with cornstarch, corn syrup, flavoring, and coloring agents, mixed into dough, chunked into 50-pound blocks, pressed into sheets. Workers painted cloth with red food dye and placed it against metal print plates inscribed with sayings. The hearts were stamped, cut, and printed simultaneously, dried under heaters, mixed together, different colors tumbling into the same bags, packaged for distribution. The Revere factory's packaging line eventually produced 400 to 500 boxes per minute. But the real magic was in the messages. A man named Walter Marshall spent nearly 5 decades as Necco's VP of planning. For most of that time, he curated the phrases that appeared on sweethearts. He added "text me" when texting became a thing. He retired "fax me" when nobody remembered what a fax was. He phased out "dig me" and "hep cat" when they stopped making sense to anyone under 70. The company received hundreds of suggestions every year. At least 60 different messages appeared in each year's production. Some phrases were perennials: "be mine," "kiss me," "true love." Others came and went with the times. The most sought-after message was always "marry me." In 2004, a Michigan resident named Mike Waltz planned to propose to his girlfriend using sweethearts. He bought bag after bag, searching for enough "marry me" hearts to make his plan work. He couldn't find them. They were rare, intentionally so. He contacted Necco directly and explained his situation. The company sent him a box full. His wife says she'll never open it. It's a keepsake. Stories like that were common at Necco. The company understood something that fancier candy brands often forgot. Their products weren't just confections, they were vessels for memory. A roll of Necco wafers wasn't competing with a Snickers bar, it was competing with nostalgia itself. Grandmothers used the wafers as practice communion hosts, a sugary sedative to keep the grandchildren quiet at church. Martha Stewart built gingerbread houses with them, using the pastel discs as roof shingles. Customers used them as poker chips, rifle range targets, toll booth tokens, even checkers. Necco sold the floor-dropped wafers, the ones that fell off the line and couldn't be packaged, as hog feed. Nothing went to waste. The modern peak of Necco was shaped by one man. Dominic Antonellis had been an auto industry engineer before he came to candy. He was installed as head of management in 1968 and named CEO in 1978. At age 37, the youngest president in company history, he would serve for nearly 30 years. Antonellis was legendarily frugal. He kept turn-of-the-century equipment running with electronic upgrades rather than buying new machines. Executive offices had bare concrete floors. Antonelli's himself enjoyed vintage linoleum in his suite. When he decided in the 1970s to restart conversation heart production, the line had been discontinued in the 1950s or 60s. His managers found the original hand-forged brass cutters in storage, but they couldn't locate the printing attachments. Antonelli's and his team worked on weekends for 4 years to get the line running again. Under his leadership, Necco grew from $10 million in annual revenue to approximately $100 million. He made 6 major acquisitions: Stark Candy in 1990, which brought the Sweethearts brand name, then Candy House, Haviland, Glen Candy, Falcon, and in 1999, Clark Bar America, purchased for $4.1 million. By 2000, Necco employed 1,200 workers. The company produced 704 different types of candy. Revenue had stabilized around $100 million. They were America's oldest continuously operating candy company, producing the country's oldest recognized candy brand. This was the summit: 1,200 workers, 700 products, a century and a half of history. And standing at that height, looking out at what seemed like a secure future, nobody inside those walls could see what was coming. The decisions that would destroy everything were already being discussed. They just didn't know it yet. In 2003, Necco made a choice that seemed reasonable at the time. The Cambridge factory was cramped. The 6-floor vertical assembly lines, powered by gravity, were outdated. "Factories just don't locate in downtown areas anymore," said one marketing manager. So they moved. The new facility sat on 50 acres at 135 American Legion Highway in Revere, Massachusetts. 810,000 square feet. Massive, modern, horizontal. It was also too big. The overhead would burden the company for years. The Historical Commission executive called Necco's departure a symbolic step in the evolution of Cambridge. The company was the last large traditional manufacturer to go. The Harvard Crimson predicted it would speed a change in the demographics of the city. Necco had been a large employer of Cambridge's immigrant labor force for generations. When Novartis took over the Cambridge building, workers had to power wash sugar from the walls. They scraped decades of candy residue from the floors. The water tower was repainted with a DNA double helix. The building was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 2005, a monument to what had been. But by then, Necco had already begun to die. The factory in Revere sat half empty, bleeding money, waiting for something to change. And something did change, just not the way anyone had hoped. The forces that would destroy Necco came from inside and outside simultaneously. And perhaps that's always how it happens. Pressure from all directions until something cracks. By the 2000s, the American candy industry had transformed beyond recognition. Through the 1960s, the market had been largely regional. Hundreds of small producers, each with their local following, each with their niche. By the 2000s, consolidation had reduced the field to approximately 150 candy producers nationwide. 5 global players, Mars, Mondelez, Hershey, Nestlé, and Ferrero, dominated the landscape. Mars and Hershey alone controlled roughly 75% of the national chocolate market and 60% of all US candy sales. The big companies used massive slotting fees to control retail shelf space. They could pay grocery chains for premium placement. They could flood the market with advertising. Small producers couldn't compete. Dave Wagers of Idaho Candy Company captured the despair. "We're lucky to get 1 or 2 boxes in the store." Meanwhile, consumer preferences were shifting. Health-conscious buyers wanted premium chocolate, organic ingredients, smaller portions. The old-fashioned, sugar-based candies that Necco had made for a century and a half, the chalky wafers, the molasses taffy, the pastel hearts, weren't what the market wanted anymore. In 2009, Necco tried to adapt. They eliminated artificial colors and flavors from the wafers, added glycerin for softness, removed the lime flavor entirely. Customers revolted. The company had misread its audience completely. People didn't buy Necco wafers because they wanted a healthy snack. They bought them because they wanted to taste their childhood. They wanted the exact same candy their grandmother had given them in church. Change the formula, and you destroy the memory. The original recipe was restored in summer 2011, but the episode revealed something troubling. A company caught between nostalgia and modernity, unable to satisfy either. And by then, Necco had bigger problems. In December 2007, a private equity firm called American Capital Strategies had orchestrated a leveraged buyout of the company for $57 million. A CAS, as it was known, was headquartered in Bethesda, Maryland, and founded by a man named Malin Wilkus. They partnered with another firm called Clear Creek Capital and with CEO Antonelli's himself. What happened next would become the subject of lawsuits and investigations for years. A CAS made a structural decision that seemed perhaps like smart financial engineering. They split Necco into two separate entities, the candy-making business and the real estate. The logic was straightforward. The Revere factory sat on 50 acres. Real estate in Greater Boston was valuable and getting more valuable every year. Why should a struggling candy company own such a valuable asset? Better to separate them, extract the value. Let the candy business lease the building it had always occupied. This allowed ACAS to profit as a landlord while the candy business continued to operate, or struggle to operate, or slowly bleed to death. According to a bankruptcy trustee who would later sue, during ACAS's ownership from 2007 to 2017, Necco sustained more than $150 million in cumulative losses. The trustee alleged that ACAS extracted money from Necco and piled on debt. By its final years, the candy business was losing at least $10 million annually. Leadership churned. Antonellis was promoted to chairman. Richard Krause, a former Procter & Gamble executive, replaced him as CEO in August 2008 and announced plans for 30% revenue growth by 2011. By November 2010, the company was listed for sale. Another CEO came and went. Then Michael McGee arrived in September 2014, a former VP of marketing at Mars Chocolate, with prior experience at Kraft Foods. He would be the last. In May 2016, a company called Ares Management acquired American Capital for $4.1 billion. The deal closed in January 2017. Then came the decisive move. In May 2017, Ares sold the Revere real estate for $54 million to developers Atlantic Management and VMD companies. Necco, the company that had occupied that building that had been synonymous with that building, was forced to lease back its own factory at $2.5 million per year. The lease would expire in August 2018. A bankruptcy trustee would later allege that Ares had blocked a prior deal that would have sold both the real estate and the candy business together, providing Necco with working capital and relocation funds. Instead, Ares chose the more profitable real estate-only sale. The candy business was left with nothing: no building, no capital, no path forward. And inside the factory, things were falling apart in ways that would soon become impossible to ignore. In June 2017, FDA inspectors arrived at the Revere facility. What they found was documented in a Form 483, the official record of inspection observations: rodent activity, building deterioration. Necco disposed of 23,000 pounds of contaminated cornstarch. The problems were noted. They were not resolved. 5 months later, inspectors returned. This time, they stayed for 31 days. The warning letter that followed, issued May 16, 2018, signed by Ronald M. Pace, addressed to CEO Michael McGee, declared Necco's products adulterated, prepared in the FDA's clinical language under conditions whereby they may have become contaminated with filth. The details read like an inventory of institutional collapse. Rodent excreta pellets were found throughout the facility. The FDA has a technical term for extreme severity: too numerous to count. That phrase appears repeatedly in the letter. Droppings weren't just near the production lines. They were on the production materials themselves, on cornstarch molds used to shape candy, on trays of corn flour for ready-to-eat caramel cores, on trays for something called Mighty Mel's, on pallets of chocolate gems, on packaging materials for sweethearts, on bags of sodium bicarbonate. Rodent urine stains were observed across multiple warehouse areas. Investigators found gnaw holes with nesting material inside a pallet of chocolate-dipped peanuts. A gnaw hole on a bag of corn flour had been covered with a sticker label, as if that would solve the problem. When an inspector removed a loose brick from a column across from the Sweethearts production staging area, it revealed a hole surrounded by droppings, too numerous to count. The company's own exterminator had reported on July 27, 2017, there is a significant amount of mice activity in the building. As of January 5, 2018, 6 months later, reports still showed active rodent infestation with the regular trapping of live mice and many open repeat conditions. A dead rodent approximately 12 inches long was found in the parking lot near the employee entrance. This was Necco's 5th citation for rodent infestation. But the rodents were only part of the story. The building itself was failing. In the Sweethearts mixing room, an unknown liquid dripped from a ventilation duct adjacent to exposed, ready-to-eat Sweethearts. The liquid was being collected into a 55-gallon drum and 2 5-gallon buckets. Employees were observed carrying exposed trays of candy within 6 inches of the dripping liquid. In the shipping area, an 8 by 3 foot puddle of standing water, a roof leak outside the finished product warehouse, a 4 by 3 foot puddle, another roof leak. Forklift trucks tracked water from these puddles into raw material and finished product storage. The sugar pulverizer room was missing several ceiling panels. Sugar had accumulated above the gap. Moisture covered the floor. The equipment was deteriorating too. After an employee inspected a ribbon blender and determined it was clean, FDA investigators found food residue on the interior surface, the surface directly above food when the blender was in vertical critical position. Old sweethearts from a previous day's production clung to a conveyor belt leading into the dryer. Heavy accumulation of residual food product and dust coated the tops and sides of extruders used to manufacture Necco wafers and sweethearts. The top belt on a dryer was frayed. Loose material from the belt was found on 2 trays of sweethearts in the cooling room. Foreign material in the candy. The company's proposed fix was to trim the belts 4 hours daily. The FDA deemed this inadequate. How did it get this bad? Workers told investigators and journalists what had happened. According to a Bloomberg report, management sharply cut costs, including money for sanitation. Monthly visits by exterminators grew sporadic, and wild rats started taking over the factory. The deferred maintenance wasn't accidental. It was the predictable consequence of a decade of financial extraction. With the real estate separated from the business, there was no incentive for the owners to invest in a building they now merely rented to a company they were bleeding dry. Jim Greenberg's family business, Union Confectionery Machinery, had supplied equipment to Necco for almost a century. He watched it happen. Everyone saw it coming. It was just a matter of when and how. The FDA warning letter was dated May 16, 2018. By then, Necco was already in bankruptcy. On March 12, 2018, CEO Michael McGee announced that most of Necco's approximately 395 workers would lose their jobs unless a buyer was found by May. The announcement triggered what would later be called the Great Necco Wafer Panic of 2018. Within 24 hours, CandyStore.com reported sales spiking more than 150%. CandyFavorites.com sold more Necco wafers in a single day than they normally sold in 6 months, depleting 90% of their inventory. Economy Candy in New York City moved 60 boxes in a day and ran out completely. One woman offered to trade her Honda Accord for a website's entire supply. Boxes of 24 rolls appeared on eBay for $35 to $300. Normal retail price was about $1.50 per roll. John Prince of CandyFavorites.com understood what was happening. What people are really trying to stockpile is a connection to their youth and their past. You're trying to hold on to a little piece of a time in life when things were cheaper and life was easier and sweeter. They weren't buying candy, they were buying memory. On April 3rd, 3 creditors, 2 packaging companies and a transport company, filed an involuntary Chapter 7 bankruptcy petition alleging $1.6 million in unpaid debts. Necco converted to Chapter 11 around April 17th. The auction was scheduled for May 23rd. 4 bidders showed up. The hearing began at 1:30 in the afternoon, but bidding didn't start until 4:30. After 6 rounds, Spangler Candy Company of Bryan, Ohio, won with a bid of $18.83 million, beating out Round Hill Investments, controlled by the Metropolis family, previously known for reviving Hostess brands Pabst Blue Ribbon and Utz potato chips. It seemed for a moment like salvation. 1 day later, Spangler informed the bankruptcy trustee that it was unwilling to close without a substantial price reduction. The FDA warning letter had been issued May 16th, just days before the auction. Spangler cited the conditions described in that letter. Trustee Harold Murphy scrambled to solicit final bids. Round Hill won at $17.33 million. The Metropolis family closed on May 31st. They issued a statement. Acquiring Necco is a special opportunity to create a robust platform designed to build critical mass and create the potential for consolidating additional confectionery brands. Round Hill missed its first $250,000 installment payment on June 30. On July 3rd, Murphy sued for breach of contract. And then on July 24, 2018, Round Hill announced immediate, permanent closure of the Revere facility. Workers were told that morning that the factory would close by the end of the day. No warning, no transition, no time to prepare. Approximately 230 workers, many of whom had spent decades on the production line, lost their jobs between one shift and the next. The workforce was largely immigrant. Many spoke primarily Spanish. Long-tenured employees included Angela Colon, who had worked on the production line for 38 years. It was her first and only job after moving from Puerto Rico in 1980. Linda Evans had worked there for over 30 years. Jose Pinto had started in 1994. A worker named Maria described the scene in the cafeteria. Some people cried because they worked a long time there, like 30 or 40 years. 30 or 40 years. And then one morning it's over. Revere Mayor Brian Arrigo: "We are disappointed that Round Hill could not follow through on the enthusiasm it expressed when it acquired Necco barely 2 months ago. We received no advance word about the situation from any representative of any of the involved parties." 2 former employees, Dexter Main and Francesco D'Amelio, filed a class action lawsuit under the WARN Act, which requires companies to give 60 days notice before mass layoffs. Main spoke at a job fair on July 30th. "It's very encouraging. It looks like a strong job market, but it doesn't change the wrongs that were committed against us. The wrongs that were committed. The machines that had run for decades went silent. The assembly lines stopped. The ovens cooled. The smell of sugar and chocolate began slowly to fade. America's oldest candy company was dead. In September 2018, the remaining Necco assets were dispersed in what Jim Greenberg called the biggest candy auction of the 21st century. America's oldest candy empire was dismembered. Spangler Candy Company, the same company that had won the initial auction and backed out, ultimately acquired Necco Wafers, Sweethearts, and Canada Mints for $18.83 million. Boyer Candy Company of Altoona, Pennsylvania, makers of Mallow Cup, purchased the Clark Bar. Owner Anthony Forgione. We're really excited. This is an iconic Pennsylvania candy. I remember the heartbreak when it left Pittsburgh. Dosh's Candies of Cincinnati, America's oldest continuously operating candy company, founded in 1871, acquired Candy Buttons. They became the first former Necco brand to return to market, using original equipment dating to at least 1919. Skybar went to Louise Mohini, owner of a gourmet food store in Sudbury, Massachusetts. She relaunched it in November 2019 using a 1970s-era recipe. Haviland Thin Mints and Mighty Malt Milk Balls went to Log House Food in Minnesota. Banana Split, Mint Julep Chews, and Slap Sticks went to Mega Candy Company in Reading, Pennsylvania. Mary Jane, the peanut butter and molasses taffy that had been made since 1914, went unsold at auction. Spangler later licensed it to Atkinson Candy Company, scattered across the country. Different owners, different factories, different futures. With the brands acquired only in September 2018, Spangler couldn't produce Sweethearts in time for Valentine's Day 2019. For the first time in over a century, America's iconic Valentine candy was unavailable. CEO Kirk Vashaw. We wish we could have Sweethearts out for the 2019 Valentine season, but it's just not possible. Spangler spent a year dismantling, packing, and relocating 60 truckloads of equipment from Revere. They used a crane to lift the largest pieces through the roof. When Sweethearts finally returned in limited quantities for Valentine's Day 2020, the results were humbling. The old printing equipment had been accidentally damaged during the move. 65% of the hearts were completely blank, 24% were unreadable, 8% were partially legible, only 3% had fully legible messages, conversation hearts that couldn't hold a conversation. By 2024, Spangler had leaned into the imperfection, launching situationships boxes with intentionally blurry, hard-to-read messages, a marketing pivot, a concession to reality. On May 27, 2020, Spangler announced that Necco Wafers were back in production and ready for retail. They were made in Mexico now. 7 of 8 flavors matched the originals identically. The chocolate wafer had a slightly richer cocoa flavor. CEO Vashaw understood what mattered. We did everything we could to keep the taste of it and the texture of it and the packaging exactly the same. The way you open it, the crinkle of the wrapper, the snap of the candy, the crinkle of the wrapper, the snap of the candy. That's what people were buying. The sensory memory of something that used to be made here by people who are gone now, in a factory that makes something else entirely. The 830,000 square foot Revere facility was not demolished. In October 2019, Mayor Arrigo announced that Amazon would lease the former candy factory as a Greater Boston delivery station. They invested $30 to $40 million in renovations. They created hundreds of jobs. In January 2020, the property was sold for $355 million to Clarion Partners of New York. $355 million. The building that Aries had extracted from Necco's balance sheet for $54 million was now worth more than 6 times that amount, more than 6 times what the candy company had ever been worth. The factory is worth more empty than it ever was full of candy. Bankruptcy trustee Harold Murphy sued Aries Capital and former Necco board members, alleging they had run the business into the ground while profiting from real estate. In December 2019, a judge denied nearly all of Aries's motions to dismiss. The eventual settlement, Aries paid $13.5 million total, waived approximately $150 million in claims against Necco, and assumed responsibility for a pension plan for former employees. Unsecured creditors received approximately 40 cents on the dollar. This was described as extraordinary, given that at the outset, it appeared highly unlikely that there would be any money available to pay creditors. The Warren Act class action against Round Hill was also settled. Affected workers received compensation for the lack of 60-day notice. Cold comfort, perhaps, but something. Boston's Fort Point neighborhood still has streets named Necco Court. Necco Street and Necco Place. A cast bronze Necco Wafer memorial sculpture, installed in 1998, stands in University Park at MIT. The Cambridge factory, now a Novartis research facility, remains on the National Register of Historic Places. Its water tower displays a DNA double helix where a giant roll of Necco wafers once stood. If you walk past 250 Massachusetts Avenue today, you won't smell chocolate, you won't smell peppermint, you won't smell the warm caramel sweetness of sugar being cooked at scale. You'll smell nothing at all. 171 years, that's how long it lasted. From Oliver Chase's hand-cranked machine in a Boston apothecary to the final shift at the Revere factory. From lozenges sold as medicine to 8 billion conversation hearts a year. From supplying armies in 2 world wars to FDA inspectors counting rodent droppings too numerous to count. A company doesn't survive that long by accident. It survives because generations of people, workers, managers, owners, believe that what they're making matters, believe that showing up for the morning shift is worth something, believe that the product they're sending out into the world carries meaning beyond its price tag. Necco wafers weren't just candy, they were the taste of a grandmother's purse, the communion host that wasn't communion, the thing your father remembered from his father, who remembered it from his. Sweethearts weren't just sugar pressed into heart shapes, they were the first Valentine a third grader ever received, the marry me that launched a marriage, the tiny message that said what someone couldn't say out loud. How do you measure the loss of something like that? The workers found other jobs, most of them. The brands found other owners. The factory found another tenant, but something disappeared that can't be recovered. John Prince, the candy seller who watched his customers panic buy Necco wafers in the spring of 2018, understood it better than anyone. What people are really trying to stockpile is a connection to their youth and their past. You're trying to hold on to a little piece of a time in life when things were cheaper and life was easier and sweeter. Sweeter, that's the word. When the GBH reporter toured the empty Revere factory months after it closed, months after the workers had been sent home, months after the machines had stopped, he noticed something strange, something that shouldn't have been there, but was. Remarkably, he wrote, the smell of candy still lingered, as if the building itself was holding on, as if a century and a half of sugar and chocolate and peppermint had soaked so deeply into the walls that even abandonment couldn't erase it. The smell is gone now. The building is an Amazon warehouse. The candy comes from Mexico and Ohio and Pennsylvania, scattered pieces of something that used to be whole. And if you stand on Massachusetts Avenue in Cambridge, across from where the factory used to run 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, for 76 years, if you stand there on a quiet morning before the traffic picks up, before the day begins, you won't hear the machines. You won't smell the chocolate. You won't see the workers streaming through the gates. You'll just see a building with a DNA double helix on the water tower, where a 40-foot roll of Necco wafers used to be. What remains is silence, and the question nobody answered in time. What happens when the people running the machine care more about the building than the candy or the people who made it?